In a nation torn by conflict, where the people have long yearned for stability and sovereignty, a new chapter is about to be written. Burkina Faso, a country ravaged by coups and political strife, now finds itself at a crossroads. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré rises to power in the wake of a sudden military coup, the promise of change seems within reach. But behind the scenes, powerful forces, both within and outside the country, are pulling strings, and the fight for control of the nation is far from over. The morning of October 1st, 2022, was shrouded in uncertainty. The air was thick with the whispers of change. On national television, a message that would shake Burkina Faso to its core was broadcast. The military had staged a coup. The announcement was brief, but its consequences were far-reaching. The official statement came from a spokesperson representing the armed forces of Burkina Faso, who declared, "The current situation is an internal crisis within the national armed forces." The coup had come swiftly. Just a day before, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Santiago de Miba, who had taken power in a coup earlier in January, was overthrown once again. His regime, which had promised stability and change, had crumbled in the face of dissent within the military ranks. The cameras captured the events unfolding with startling speed, and soon after, a statement from the forces loyal to Captain Ibrahim Traoré confirmed the coup. For the citizens of Burkina Faso, it was a moment of shock, but also one of disbelief. The country had already experienced so much turmoil over the past year, and now, with the overthrow of a second leader in less than a year, many wondered how much more the nation could endure. The television broadcasts were filled with images of soldiers in fatigues, their faces stern and resolute, as they took control of key areas of the capital. Amid the chaos, a statement was released by Captain Traoré, accusing de Miba of hiding at a French military base and planning a counterattack after being ousted. The allegations added an international dimension to the unfolding crisis. According to Traoré, de Miba was not merely a leader who had been overthrown. He was now an enemy, plotting with foreign powers. However, the French embassy swiftly denied any involvement, dismissing the rumors of their military's participation. But the seeds of mistrust had already been sown. The accusations of foreign involvement in Burkina Faso's internal affairs only fueled the growing suspicion among the people. Some feared that the country was becoming a battleground for international powers, each vying for influence in a region already destabilized by extremism and insurgencies. The announcement of the coup had divided the nation, with some supporting Traoré's swift actions, believing that he would bring a fresh approach to the country's long-standing issues. Others, however, viewed the military takeover as just another chapter in the endless cycle of instability that had plagued Burkina Faso for years. As the days passed following the coup, a deeper and more dangerous tension began to surface within the ranks of the military. While the announcement of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's takeover had been swift and decisive, the consequences of his actions were far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Inside the military, a growing sense of unease spread like wildfire. The armed forces, once united in their mission to stabilize the country, were now fractured. Officers who had once stood side by side in battle began to question the very legitimacy of the coup. Traoré's rapid rise to power had left many feeling excluded and unsettled. Some saw Traoré's decisive actions as a much-needed shift in power, a break from the old order. But others, particularly high-ranking officers who had been loyal to de Miba, viewed his rise with growing skepticism. They questioned his experience, his motives, and most dangerously, his connections. Was he acting independently, or was there something more behind his swift rise to power? What many of these officers had failed to recognize was the level of internal conflict within their own ranks. Within the closed-door meetings, the divisions were clear. Some military leaders who had previously been part of de Miba's camp had begun to question the wisdom of overthrowing a leader who had fought so hard for power. They saw the coup as a betrayal of everything they had worked for. To them, de Miba's downfall was not a matter of principle, but a matter of power dynamics. The question soon became, who would fill the void left by Damiba's removal? At the same time, Traore's supporters, who were just as determined, began to feel the weight of his leadership. Despite his military background, he was no seasoned politician. Many questioned whether Traore had the diplomatic skills necessary to navigate the volatile waters of international politics, or if his bold actions would alienate Burkina Faso's allies. The military leadership found itself in a precarious position. They were no longer united by the common goal of removing a tyrant from power. They were divided by personal ambitions and deep ideological rifts. Each faction of the military had its own vision for Burkina Faso's future, and the growing uncertainty about who was truly in control threatened to spill into the streets. On October 3rd, a series of protests erupted in the capital. The streets were filled with people who, disillusioned by the coup, began to express their dissatisfaction. They had hoped that Traore's rise would bring stability, but they were already seeing cracks in the facade of unity. Some protesters clamored for Damiba's return, believing his leadership had been taken from them too soon. Others called for an entirely new government, one that was not bound by military rule. Meanwhile, the international community watched closely, but from a distance. The French embassy, already under scrutiny due to the accusations surrounding their involvement with Damiba, issued another statement, reiterating their neutrality and calling for a peaceful resolution. However, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. The French government's position had become a point of contention within Burkina Faso. Amidst the political chaos, Captain Traore was faced with a daunting decision. Would he take a more inclusive approach, attempting to bridge the growing divides within his military ranks? Or would he dig in his heels and crush the dissenting voices before they could undermine his rule? The next steps he took would determine not only his future, but the future of Burkina Faso itself. The military barracks buzzed with conflicting whispers as the dust settled over the capital. For the people of Burkina Faso, the aftermath of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's coup was a paradox. Some cheered the new leader, eager for change after months of instability and failed promises. Others, however, viewed his rise as a continuation of the same power struggles that had plagued the country for decades. In the immediate days following the coup, Traoré moved quickly to consolidate his power, but his actions were not without consequences. The swift and decisive nature of his takeover left little room for negotiation with the old guard. The nation's top military officers, many of whom had been loyal to Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Santiago Damiba, began to feel the weight of their newfound uncertainty. No longer in control, they faced the reality that they were now pawns in a game far beyond their command. For the men and women of the military, this wasn't just about political rivalry. It was about their very existence, their future in the military. As Traoré began to purge key figures from Damiba's government, the rifts deepened. Those loyal to Damiba felt betrayed, their futures uncertain in the face of this new, unpredictable regime. Traoré's orders were clear. Any remaining supporters of Damiba must be removed from power. But Traoré's vision of reform wasn't universally accepted. He was a young, ambitious officer with little experience in political diplomacy. His swift rise to power had caused some to question whether he could truly lead the country through the challenges ahead. While the military's rank-and-file troops followed his orders, the higher-ranking officers remained divided. As part of his strategy to secure his control, Traoré implemented a series of measures that seemed, on the surface, to be in the best interests of the country. He ordered the closing of Burkina Faso's borders and announced the suspension of the constitution, citing the need for national security in the face of external and internal threats. A nationwide curfew was imposed, signaling that the military was now in complete control of the nation's affairs. Yet these actions only seemed to deepen the crisis. The imposition of martial law caused widespread panic and confusion. With the country's borders closed, many feared the economic consequences, especially as Burkina Faso had long depended on trade with its neighbors. And while the curfew was meant to restore order, it only increased tensions, as people found themselves increasingly distrustful of the very forces that were supposed to protect them. The international community, too, began to react. The French embassy, still in the eye of the storm following the coup, denied any involvement in the events unfolding. They firmly rejected the accusations that Damiba had been under their protection, insisting that France would remain neutral. However, the rumor mill had already taken over, and many within Burkina Faso believed that France's support for Damiba was far from over. On October 2nd, Traore made a public address to the nation, reaffirming his commitment to the country's security and future. His words were met with mixed reactions. Some saw his speech as a call to arms, a rallying cry to unite the people against both internal and external enemies. Others, however, viewed it as the rhetoric of a man hungry for power, a man who had overthrown one leader only to replace him with another authoritarian regime. Meanwhile, Damiba, having been ousted, took refuge in a French military base, according to Traore's accusations. The French embassy's firm denials only fueled the fire, casting doubt on the true nature of international involvement in Burkina Faso's political crisis. The presence of foreign military forces, real or imagined, had become a symbol of the larger geopolitical struggle playing out behind the scenes. As the military purges continued, Traore's power seemed increasingly unshakable. Yet, despite his firm control over the situation, a sense of unease loomed over the country. With political divisions growing, the real battle for Burkina Faso's soul had just begun. The question remained: would Traore's leadership lead the country into a new era of stability, or would it deepen the divide, plunging Burkina Faso into a future where loyalty, ambition, and power were constantly at odds? The closing of Burkina Faso's borders marked a dramatic shift in the country's trajectory, but the immediate effects were anything but reassuring. The military had successfully secured control of key regions, but the sense of unease continued to rise. The curfew, imposed from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., had further isolated the country, and the once bustling streets of Ouagadougou now lay eerily silent at night, a ghost town under the watchful eyes of soldiers patrolling the streets. For the citizens of Burkina Faso, life had already become a careful balance of survival and uncertainty. No one knew what would happen next, whether the international community would respond with sanctions, or if more violence would follow in the wake of Traore's rapid consolidation of power. The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone wondered just how far Traore would go to secure his position and what consequences those actions would bring. In the barracks, the mood was one of uncertainty. Officers who had supported Damiba's regime now found themselves at a crossroads. Some had been removed from their posts, others were left in limbo, unsure if they would fall under Traore's scrutiny. While the coup had brought swift changes, it had also deepened fractures within the military. Loyalties were being tested, and not everyone was willing to follow the new leader without question. Major Traore, a seasoned officer who had previously been a key supporter of Damiba, was one of those who questioned Traore's rule. He had been on the front lines of the earlier coup against the former president, and now, with the borders closed and the constitution suspended, Traore felt that Burkina Faso was being led down a path of authoritarian rule. But Major Traore's plans were not without risks. If the coup had shown anything, it was that the military's unity was fragile, and there were powerful forces at play behind the scenes. There were whispers in the halls of the military base, rumors that some officers were already aligning themselves with Traore, seeking to secure their positions in the new regime. Traore, aware of the shifting allegiances, knew that his every move would be watched. Meanwhile, on the streets, life was becoming increasingly difficult. The closure of the borders had caused major disruptions to trade, with many businesses facing shortages of goods and rising prices. The price of fuel had skyrocketed, and the once thriving markets were now eerily empty. People began to panic buy, and the scarcity of essential goods only fueled fears that the country was on the brink of collapse. Humanitarian organizations working in the region were now faced with a more complicated task. Aid convoys, which previously crossed the border into neighboring countries, were no longer able to deliver essential supplies. The risk of a humanitarian crisis was growing, and the government was left struggling to find a way to address the dire situation. Foreign governments had been silent in the days following the coup, but there was growing concern about the implications for regional security. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. Ibrahim Traoré, despite his military successes, found himself increasingly cornered. His actions had divided the country, and the challenges of governance were becoming more apparent. His attempts to maintain order in the country through forceful measures were met with growing resistance. Despite the appearance of control, the internal divisions within the military were becoming harder to conceal, and the threat of further violence seemed imminent. In a rare public address, Traoré attempted to reassure the people of Burkina Faso, promising that the borders would reopen soon and that the country's stability would return. However, his words did little to quell the growing unrest. The scars left by the coup were deep, and the promise of a better future seemed increasingly uncertain. As the days dragged on, the question of what would happen next loomed large. Would Traoré's government be able to hold the country together, or would the internal and external pressures prove too much to bear? One thing was certain. Burkina Faso was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the next moves, both by its leaders and its people, would determine the nation's fate. As the weeks wore on, the uncertainty in Burkina Faso reached a boiling point. The imposition of martial law, the closing of the borders, and the dissolution of the constitution had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The military, once a unified force, was now riddled with internal strife. The high command was fractured, and those who had supported Damiba found themselves marginalized under Traoré's regime. In the shadows, Major Diarra had begun to gather support. He was not alone in his discontent. There were several officers, veterans of previous coups and military operations, who were quietly preparing for a counteroffensive. Their plan was simple: to destabilize Traoré's rule and restore the old order, perhaps even bringing Damiba back to power. They had learned from the mistakes of the past. This time, they would not rely on the whims of foreign powers or outside interventions. However, the coup was not without its challenges. Diarra and his supporters knew that moving too quickly would spell disaster. They had to be patient, methodical. They needed the right moment, when the government's control was weakest, when the people were most vulnerable. In the meantime, they quietly built alliances with regional militia groups and factions within the military that had previously been loyal to Damiba. They knew the country's political landscape had shifted, and the support of the people would be key. But the cracks in the new regime were starting to show. Traoré, despite his bold military actions, was struggling to maintain control. His government was still young, fragile, and surrounded by enemies, both within and outside the country. The promises of stability and security that had propelled him to power were beginning to ring hollow as food prices soared. The streets remained deserted under curfew, and the population's patience began to wear thin. One fateful evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets grew quiet under the curfew, the first shot rang out. It was not the typical sound of a distant conflict, but the sharp crack of gunfire followed by the eruption of chaos. In the heart of the capital, a key government official was assassinated in broad daylight, a bold and brazen act that sent shockwaves through the capital. As the news spread like wildfire, the military responded quickly, sealing off the area and beginning a sweeping investigation into the assassination. Traoré's inner circle was in turmoil. Who was behind the killing? Was it a rogue faction of the military, or was it part of a larger conspiracy to undermine his rule? The streets of Ouagadougou, which had once been quiet under the curfew, now erupted in protests. People were no longer willing to wait in silence. The assassination had been a signal, a declaration that the country was once again on the edge of a breakdown. The people, who had hoped for stability under Traoré's leadership, were now asking whether the military, once seen as the guarantor of peace, had become the very thing that would tear the nation apart. Traoré, while not directly linked to the assassination, saw the event as an opportunity. The unrest had given him the perfect cover to rally his forces. The military, already divided, was now more vulnerable than ever. Traoré knew that in times of crisis, the military would look to its strong leaders for direction. His chance to strike had arrived. Traoré, in a desperate bid to maintain control, called for an emergency meeting of his closest military allies. His voice, once confident and commanding, was now tinged with frustration and fear. "This attack was just the beginning," he said. "We cannot allow this country to fall into chaos. We need to act swiftly to restore order." But as the meeting continued, Traoré knew that his options were limited. The divisions within the military were growing, and his position was weakening. Each day that passed without a clear victory over the insurgents, the more fragile his rule became. Outside the walls of the meeting room, the echoes of gunfire and protest filled the streets. The battle for Burkina Faso's future had entered its most dangerous phase, and every decision made from this point forward would carry the weight of the nation's destiny. The first shot had been fired, and no one knew what the next few hours or days would bring. In the days following the assassination, the tension in Burkina Faso reached new heights. The military, now at a crossroads, was split between those loyal to Traoré and those secretly sympathizing with the insurgents. The streets, once quiet under curfew, now thrummed with the anxiety of a nation on the brink of chaos. News of the assassination had sparked both outrage and fear. Rumors spread faster than the government could act, and every corner of Ouagadougou became a potential flashpoint for violence. The military's response was swift but heavy-handed. Traoré's inner circle intensified their grip on power, tightening security across the city. Roadblocks were set up at every major intersection, and heavily armed soldiers patrolled the streets, their faces obscured behind dark visors. But despite the increased presence of troops, the unrest simmered just beneath the surface. Within the ranks of the military, Major Traoré moved with calculated precision. His faction, now united under a single banner, had quietly infiltrated key positions in the government and military. They had laid the groundwork for a new assault, a coordinated push to bring down Traoré's regime. Their plan was clear: destabilize the capital, create confusion, and strike at the heart of Traoré's leadership. But the coup they were plotting was not without its risks. The country's fragile state meant that even a minor misstep could ignite a full-scale civil war. Despite the dangers, Traoré's resolve was unwavering. He knew that this was the only chance he and his supporters had to reclaim control of the country. As much as he despised Traoré's swift rise to power, he believed that his own leadership, bolstered by a return to the old guard, could bring stability back to Burkina Faso. On the evening of October 5th, as dusk fell over the city, a sense of foreboding settled across Ouagadougou. The streets were empty, save for the occasional soldier moving cautiously through the shadows. Behind closed doors, the military leaders loyal to Traoré were deliberating on their next move. The president's closest advisors were divided, with some advocating for a full-scale assault on the insurgents, while others feared that doing so would only escalate the violence. Then came the silence. For a brief moment, the chaos of the past few days seemed to halt. The gunfire, the protests, the cries of the people, all of it seemed to fade into a quiet stillness. It was as though the entire country had held its breath, but within that stillness there was something even more dangerous, a sense of impending doom. It was in this silence that the second wave of Traoré's coup began to unfold. At precisely 11:00 p.m., the first of many military checkpoints around Ouagadougou were silently taken over by insurgents loyal to Traoré. These were not the loud clashes of battle, but a quiet, methodical occupation. Soldiers in Traoré's army, either sympathizers or coerced into submission, opened the gates, allowing insurgent forces to slip through the city's defenses. By the time the military leadership loyal to Traoré realized what was happening, it was too late. Communications were severed. The military's encrypted radio systems, once thought to be foolproof, were hacked and rendered useless. The power struggle was now not just internal, it had become a battle for control of the nation's capital. Meanwhile, Traore himself remained isolated in a secure location, unaware of the extent of the insurgents' movements. His bodyguards, loyal to him but outnumbered by the insurgents, tried desperately to maintain control. The president's advisors were in a state of panic. As the first signs of betrayal became apparent, Traore's trusted commanders began to retreat from key positions, realizing the magnitude of the threat they faced. The sudden surge of insurgent forces caught everyone off guard. Traore, who had once seemed unassailable in his power, now appeared to be a man on the defensive. His enemies, once thought to be disorganized, had found their moment, and they were striking with precision. By dawn, the city was divided. Traore's forces were trapped in pockets of resistance, unable to effectively communicate or coordinate their response. Traore, seeing the opening, made a bold move. With his forces already positioned within the capital, he issued a public statement, calling on the people of Burkina Faso to rally behind him for the sake of their country's future. Today, Traore's message echoed over the airwaves, "We reclaim what was taken from us. The people's will is stronger than any force of tyranny. It is time for Burkina Faso to rise again." The response was immediate. The streets, which had been silent just hours earlier, now buzzed with movement. Protesters, fueled by anger and frustration, poured out into the streets, demanding the resignation of Traore. The lines between the military and the civilians began to blur as both sides now fought for control of the country's soul. Traore, cornered and unsure of his next steps, watched as the nation he had sworn to protect began to slip from his grasp. The quiet before the storm had ended, and now the winds of revolution were howling through the streets of Ouagadougou. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou, the once vibrant city now seemed gripped by an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The events of the night had changed everything. The streets, once a battleground for opposing military factions, were now filled with civilians demanding action, a clear indication that the balance of power was shifting in real time. The insurgent forces, led by Major Traore, had made remarkable gains, capturing strategic military outposts and key government buildings. But as the insurgents advanced, there was something more at play, a force operating from behind the curtain. Traore, though charismatic and commanding, was not the sole orchestrator of the coup. The true mastermind was far more elusive, a figure whose influence stretched beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In the quiet corners of government offices, Zongo, the head of Traore's internal security, was piecing together the fragments of a disturbing puzzle. He had been Traore's most trusted ally, a man who had once believed in the president's vision for a free and sovereign Burkina Faso. But now, Zongo was beginning to realize that the revolution, the coup, and the military upheaval were only part of a much larger scheme. Zongo had been tracking the mysterious communications between Traore's insurgents and an unknown entity. It was clear now that Traore, despite his military brilliance, was being used. The messages he intercepted were not directed from within the country, but rather from external sources, foreign powers, multinational corporations, and global elites who saw Burkina Faso's political instability as an opportunity to manipulate the country's future. The mastermind behind the operation was a shadowy figure who had been manipulating both Damiba and Traore from the very beginning. Known only as the architect, this figure was not a foreign government or a lone soldier, but rather a collective of powerful interests that had grown weary of Burkina Faso's resistance to foreign influence. They had seen the country's struggle for independence as a challenge to their dominance in the region. Zongo's discovery sent chills down his spine. As Traore's right-hand man, he had trusted the military to act in the best interests of the nation. But now he realized that his loyalty had been misplaced. The coup was not a fight for the people of Burkina Faso. It was a fight for power, orchestrated by forces beyond their borders. The implications of Zongo's findings were staggering. If the architect's plan succeeded, Burkina Faso would no longer be able to chart its own course. The nation would be drawn into the webs of foreign influence, a puppet in a game of geopolitics. Zongo knew that the only way to stop the collapse of his country was to expose the truth and sever the ties between Traoré's insurgents and their foreign backers. But this was easier said than done. The architect had ensured that his agents were deeply embedded within the highest echelons of both the military and the government. Zongo, who had once trusted his fellow officers, now realized that he was fighting a battle against a hidden enemy, one that was far more dangerous and insidious than he had ever imagined. Desperate to prevent Burkina Faso from falling further into the clutches of foreign powers, Zongo reached out to a few loyal officers within Traoré's remaining forces. Together, they began to formulate a plan, one that involved striking at the heart of the conspiracy. They would need to uncover the architect's identity and expose the international network that was pulling the strings. But with each passing hour, the window of opportunity was closing. Zongo's plan was risky, and it would require him to infiltrate the very heart of the insurgency. He knew that exposing the architect would be no small feat, but it was the only way to save Burkina Faso from complete collapse. If they could reveal the extent of foreign interference, they might just have a chance to rally the people and the military behind Traoré once again. As the situation grew more dire, Zongo knew that time was running out. The battle for Burkina Faso's future was no longer just about military strength. It was about who controlled the narrative, who had the power to shape the country's destiny. And with every passing day, the architect's grip on Burkina Faso tightened. As Zongo and his small, loyal group of officers continued to dig deeper into the conspiracy, the magnitude of the operation began to unfold. Every move they made seemed to lead them closer to the same unsettling conclusion. The architect was not a single person, but a network, a sprawling web of multinational interests, political figures, and military contractors who had long been waiting for an opportunity to reshape the future of Burkina Faso. Zongo, now acutely aware of the foreign powers at play, felt a growing sense of urgency. The insurgency led by Traoré was merely a symptom of the larger disease that had taken root in the country. What was happening on the ground, the battles between military factions, the chaos in the streets, was all part of a larger strategy to weaken Burkina Faso, to prevent it from becoming a true sovereign state. But Zongo was determined to stop it, no matter the cost. The deeper Zongo and his team dug, the more they discovered how entrenched these foreign agents were. They had their hands in nearly every facet of the country: military contracts, mining rights, international aid, even the media. Every major decision in Burkina Faso's recent history had been influenced by these unseen players who had been working in the shadows for years. One breakthrough came when Zongo uncovered a series of encrypted messages sent between Traoré's insurgents and a mysterious entity based in a foreign country. The messages contained detailed plans for the coup and the strategic capture of key government installations. But what shocked Zongo the most was the final part of the communication: a list of names of high-ranking military officers, politicians, and businessmen who were paid to help destabilize the country. Zongo now knew that the coup was just the beginning. What was unfolding was part of a broader, long-term plan to dismantle Burkina Faso's sovereignty. And at the center of it all was the architect, a figure who had so carefully woven together the threads of manipulation and deceit, pulling them in every direction. Whoever this figure was, they were playing a dangerous game of chess with the future of an entire nation. With the information in hand, Zongo made the fateful decision to take his findings directly to Traoré. The president, recovering from the initial stages of the coup, was now more determined than ever to restore order to the country. Zongo knew this was a gamble, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy could either solidify Traoré's power or tear the country apart even more. In a secret meeting that was held under the cover of night, Zongo presented the evidence to Traoré. The president listened in stunned silence as Zongo outlined the scope of the conspiracy, detailing the foreign powers who had their eyes on Burkina Faso's resources and the internal traders who had sold their country for a price. "There are powerful forces at work, sir," Zongo said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Daira and the insurgents may be just pawns in a much larger game. If we don't act swiftly, we could lose Burkina Faso forever." Traoré's face hardened. The weight of the situation settled in as he grasped the full scale of the threat facing his country. His military, his people, everything was being manipulated by a shadowy figure whose goals went beyond mere political power. "We must expose them," Traoré said finally, his voice low but resolute. "We must show the people the truth. If the country is to have a future, we cannot let this foreign influence take hold." But the reality was grim. As Zongo's revelation sank in, it became clear that Traoré's forces were still too divided to mount an effective counteroffensive. The insurgents, backed by these foreign powers, had already infiltrated key military installations and government offices. It was not just the loyalty of the military that was in question, it was the country's very foundation. To expose the conspiracy, Zongo and Traoré would need to act quickly and decisively. They needed to secure the support of the people, rally the remaining loyal officers, and begin a campaign of truth that would unravel the web of deceit. The battle had shifted. It was no longer just about a military takeover. It was about a fight for Burkina Faso's sovereignty against unseen forces that wanted to turn the nation into a puppet state. The clock was ticking. Daira's insurgents were still in control of much of the capital, and the people were growing restless. Traoré's government was teetering on the edge, but Zongo's discoveries had provided them with a fighting chance. The next few days would be critical, but one thing was certain: this was no longer a battle just for power. It was a battle for the future of Burkina Faso itself. And in that fight, only one thing would guarantee victory: the truth. The days following the secret meeting with Traoré were filled with tension. The fate of Burkina Faso hung in the balance. Zongo had been working tirelessly to gather more evidence, building a case that could expose the full extent of the conspiracy. The people of Burkina Faso, once hopeful that Traoré's rise to power would bring stability, were now increasingly disillusioned. They had watched as their country descended further into chaos, with street protests becoming a regular occurrence and everyday life growing more difficult by the hour. The curfew, the military presence, the closing of the borders, each new measure deepened their sense of oppression. They needed hope, and they needed to believe that their leaders were fighting for them. Zongo knew that in order to turn the tide, Traoré had to make a bold move, something that would galvanize the population and unite them against the forces that sought to control their country. It was time to expose the truth, but doing so would not be easy. The power of the international syndicate behind the architect was vast. They had infiltrated the government, the military, and even the media. Traoré's government, though determined, was still fragile. With Zongo's information in hand, Traoré prepared to address the nation. It would be his most critical speech yet, one that would either unite the country in a common cause or drive it deeper into despair. His advisors urged him to wait, to build more support and prepare for a military counterattack. But Traoré knew that the time for waiting had passed. If the truth was not revealed now, the country could not survive the coming storm. On the evening of October 8th, just as the sun began to set over Ouagadougou, Traoré made his way to the national television studio. The streets outside were unusually quiet. The tension was almost tangible. People gathered around their radios and television sets, not knowing what to expect. What would their leader say? Would he announce a victory, a surrender, or something else entirely? As the broadcast began, Traoré's face appeared on the screen. His expression was grim but determined, his eyes locked with the camera as if speaking directly to every citizen of Burkina Faso. He began by acknowledging the immense challenges facing the country, the pain, the loss, and the suffering that had become a daily reality. He spoke of the assassination attempts, the civil unrest, and the threats from both within and outside the country. But then, Traore dropped the bombshell. "My fellow countrymen," he began, his voice steady, "what you have witnessed in recent weeks is not just a military coup. It is the culmination of a long-standing plan to destroy the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. It is a battle for the future of our nation, one that has been manipulated by external forces and traitors within our own ranks." The room fell silent as Zongo watched from behind the scenes. He knew that this moment, this declaration, would either save their country or shatter it. "The men who have conspired against us," Traore continued, "are not just a group of rebels. They are a network of foreign powers, multinational corporations, and high-ranking officials who have long sought to exploit Burkina Faso's resources and control its destiny. These forces have been pulling the strings from behind the curtain, using individuals like Major Traoré as pawns in their game." Zongo watched the monitor as the words echoed through the nation. This was the moment of truth. The people would now see the extent of the conspiracy, and it was up to them to decide what came next. Would they rise to defend their country, or would the weight of this revelation tear them apart? "We are not just fighting for power," Traore said, his voice gaining strength. "We are fighting for our independence, for our future. The forces against us are strong, but they are not invincible. Together, we will reclaim our sovereignty, and we will build a Burkina Faso that is free from foreign manipulation and corruption." The speech had barely ended when the streets outside erupted. People poured into the streets in a wave of protest and support, calling for unity and action. The truth had set fire to the nation's collective spirit, and the battle lines were drawn. But Traore and Zongo knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The insurgents would not back down easily, and the foreign powers behind them would stop at nothing to see their plans succeed. With the people now behind him, Traore ordered a final mobilization of loyal forces. The military's fragmented factions were reassembled, and strategic strikes were launched across the capital to reclaim key government buildings and military outposts. The battle for Burkina Faso's soul was in full swing. But the insurgency had already been warned. Major Traoré, seeing the growing unity of the people, began to prepare for a last-ditch effort to seize the capital. His forces, bolstered by foreign support, were preparing to make their final push, and the outcome would determine whether Burkina Faso would remain free or be swallowed by the shadow of external control. Zongo stood beside Traore, knowing that the next 24 hours would define the future of their country. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time for action. Would the people and the military unite to fight for their nation's independence, or would they fall to the powerful forces seeking to control their fate? The clock ticked down as the streets of Ouagadougou became a battleground. Traore's bold speech had ignited a fire in the hearts of Burkina Faso's people. They rallied in droves, flooding the streets with chants of defiance and support for their president. It was no longer just a fight between rival factions of the military. It was a national uprising, one that transcended the uniforms, the weapons, and the power struggles. In the heart of the capital, the air was thick with tension. Soldiers loyal to Traore had fortified key government positions, while the insurgents, led by Major Traoré, prepared for their final assault. They knew that the time for decisive action had come. The insurgents, though well-equipped and bolstered by foreign powers, were divided in their resolve. Traoré's forces were spread thin, struggling to maintain control over strategic points as Traore's loyalists gained momentum in the streets. At the presidential palace, Traore and his closest advisors were in the midst of finalizing their plan. Zongo stood at the center of the room, watching the president closely. The decision ahead was clear. This battle would determine whether Burkina Faso would remain free or fall under the sway of foreign interests. The stakes were higher than ever. "We cannot afford to fail," Traore said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. "Our people have given us their trust. If we back down now, everything we've fought for will be lost. We will take back this country no matter the cost." Zongo nodded in agreement. It had been a long, hard road to get here. They had exposed the corruption, rallied the military, and united the people. But the final battle was yet to be fought, and it would not be easy. As night fell, the final phase of the conflict began. The military clashed in the streets, exchanging gunfire beneath the glow of streetlights. The roar of battle reverberated through the city as insurgent forces fought fiercely to hold their ground. Major Diarra's forces, although powerful, were starting to lose their cohesion. Traore's supporters, inspired by the president's call for unity, pushed forward with unrelenting force. They knew that this was their moment to reclaim their country. In a critical move, Traore ordered his forces to strike at the heart of the insurgency, the military headquarters where Diarra had set up his command center. It was a bold and dangerous maneuver, but Traore knew it was the only way to end the rebellion once and for all. As loyal soldiers stormed the building, Diarra was cornered in the war room, his face a mask of frustration and desperation. The final confrontation between Traore and Diarra was inevitable. Traore entered the war room, his gaze unwavering as he faced the man who had once been his ally. Diarra, still standing tall, met his gaze, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm. "You think you've won, don't you?" Diarra sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're just a puppet in a larger game. You'll never control this country, not while the real powers are behind the scenes pulling the strings." Traore's expression hardened. "The people of Burkina Faso are the only power that matters. You've forgotten that. And today, you'll see the consequences of betraying your own people." Without another word, Traore motioned for his soldiers to secure the area. Diarra was arrested, and the insurgency's grip on the capital was broken. For the first time in weeks, the sounds of battle began to subside. As the dust settled, Traore addressed the nation once more. His voice echoed through the streets of Ouagadougou, reaching every corner of the country. "Burkina Faso is free," he declared, his voice filled with resolve. "We have overcome the forces that sought to divide us, the foreign powers that sought to control us, and the traitors who would have seen us fall. Today, we stand united. Today, we reclaim our future." The streets erupted in jubilation. The people of Burkina Faso had risen to protect their country's sovereignty, and together they had succeeded. The battle for their nation's future had been won, not just through military force, but through unity, resilience, and the unwavering belief that their country could stand on its own. But as Traore stood before the people, he knew that the real work was only beginning. The fight for independence had not ended with the defeat of Diarra's forces. Now, it was time to rebuild, to heal the wounds of the past and lay the foundation for a new Burkina Faso, one that was truly free and sovereign. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Hope that Burkina Faso could rise from the ashes of betrayal and become a beacon of independence in a world that often sought to keep it down. And as the nation looked to the future, they did so with the knowledge that their destiny was in their own hands. The dust has settled, but the battle for Burkina Faso's soul is far from over. After months of bloodshed and division, the people of Burkina Faso have risen, united in their fight for independence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once a symbol of hope, now stands as the leader of a nation forged by sacrifice. But with victory comes the weight of responsibility. The journey to rebuild, to heal the wounds of betrayal, and to secure a future free from foreign influence has just begun.